So the Fender Princeton Reverb. This is one of the, again, quintessential 15-watt amps. It's one of the quintessential Fender amps. It's a superb amplifier. It's very, very well known. It's a very sought-after amplifier, but in kind of a different way. This sounds kind of silly, but I feel like a lot of guitar players have this kind of flirty romance with the Fender Princeton, right? So if you look at other amps in the Fender line, something like the Super Reverb, like I've got next to me, people look at that like, you know, that's kind of this holy grail mythical beast status. You look at the twin reverb like that's the beast. That's, as I like to say, that is the king of clean. You look at the deluxe reverb and you kind of say that's the gig master. Then you look at the Princeton reverb and people are kind of like, well, hey, do you come here often? Can I buy you a drink? There's something a little bit more spunky about them character-wise, but in still a very serious way and still in a really rich and respected way. I think one of the funny things about a Princeton is if you see someone with a Princeton, generally speaking, you kind of go, all right, I get it. They're a guitar player who's probably pretty good, but doesn't take themselves too seriously to need some kind of monstrous rig. I really love how Keith Williams put this in his history of the Princeton Reverb amplifier, which is, if your Princeton can't keep up with your band, then your band is probably too loud. Absolutely love that. I think that is so true. This is a small, low-watt, easy-to-carry and use amplifier, but it doesn't sound small and boxy. It will break up at a semi-reasonable volume, but it's not too quiet for gigs. It's a really unique amp that sits in a really nice spot. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is the amp that guitar players should have is, I've talked about other Fender amps. I've made the case that the Vibrolux may be the best Fender amp ever. I believe that the Twin Reverb is the king of cleans. I believe that the Super Reverb is, you know, again, worthy of Holy Grail status. But the Princeton is something, it's got a Fender tone, and it's got the Fender thing going in a classic way that covers a lot of territory, and because of its size and its ease of use and everything, its versatility, I think, makes it, if you can only get one Fender amp, this is probably the one to have to cover your Fender tonal needs. Now, I do want to mention real quick, some of what I'm talking about is about the Fender Princeton in general. Some of it is going to be specific to this model. The model that I'm playing in the video is the 65 Reissue. It is the current production model. It is the one that if you were to order it off of Sweetwater right now, you'd get this one that I'm playing. It's unmodded, nothing fancy going on. Has the Jensen C10R speaker as you get stock tubes and everything. When I talk about if there's one amp you can have, it should be a Princeton. I am talking about Princetons to a certain extent in general, whether you were to get this one or the 68 Custom, or whether you're to get a hand-wired one or a vintage one, whatever. That I'm kind of talking about the Princeton in general. I am going to talk about this amp in particular regarding how to get some of the tones out of it. Now, with Princetons in general, one of the things, some are 12 watts, some are 15 watts. It does depend on the model. But what I have found is that they get a very, very rich Fender Overdrive, and again, at not an unreasonable volume. Now, if you stay tuned to the end, I am going to play this amp wide open. I'm going to play this amp totally turned up, a couple of different places in between, and also kind of a unique special tone that I'm not going to tell you about until the end, because it's kind of fun. When I turned it all the way up, I'm sitting in the room with it, and it was actually pointing it was sitting behind me, about, I don't know, 7 or 8 feet away from me, and pointing right at me. And with it turned all the way up, I wasn't crazy uncomfortable. It was loud. It was really loud. It was too loud for a lot of settings, but it wasn't that kind of like slightly painful bone-crushing loud that you get from some amplifiers. The other thing is that when you turn it all the way up, it has a richness and a smoothness, and it's a very, very recordable tone. It's a great tone for studio use, but again, it's also a tone that you can get semi-close to if you're playing live. If you're playing in a rock band and you need a little more volume, again, you can go back to what Keith Williams said. You can always mic it, in many cases, you can mic your amplifier, and there you're fine as far as volume goes. But the other thing that's really cool about them is because they're small and they're 15 watts and you got your 10-inch speaker, you can get it to a point where the power tubes are warmer earlier than you can with other amps. So whether or not it's distorting, it will sound full. You know, it doesn't sound boxy like you get from some of the little 4 or 5 watt amplifiers. It doesn't sound small. It almost sounds like it's pre-EQ'd. It doesn't have some of the frequencies that can tend to muddy it up in a mix, and it has the nice, clear, glassy Fender blackface sound, but with a little bit of compression and punchiness to it that just really makes it very well suited for recording and gigging. It sits very, very well. It sits in a nice sonic space where you get a lot of clarity to your notes, but again, you know, you're not talking about it just being... If you think about, if you plug a Telecaster on the bridge pickup into a deluxe reverb, and you know, you turn it up to like 5 and you hit a chord, and that's like, on a Princeton, it's got a little more sync and a little more give to it, but also a little bit more punch and this kind of nice, slightly compressed focus that just really, really works. On top of that, one of the things that I love is it has the rich Fender reverb and tremolo that I'd like to say we all know and love. Many of us know and love. It's the character of the Fender blackface reverb that you absolutely love. But one of the things that I like about it is it's present, but it doesn't wash out. Like, you know, so I got my Super Reverb next to me. I love this amplifier. I've used this amplifier gigging and recording just about as much as any other amplifier, maybe with the exception of a Fender Bassman, which is also one of my other favorites. But on a Super Reverb, you know, with the reverb getting up to like 3.5, 4, you're getting already pretty close to Fish Tank City. On a Princeton, you can push the reverb a little bit more, and the attack of your note is still more present, and you get that really rich lusciousness of the reverb, but it just fits in with the note a little bit differently. Also works really well to have the reverb up a little bit with an overdrive pedal into it. Now, I mentioned we're going to use some pedals in this. Obviously, it will drive on its own at semi-reasonable volumes, but for most settings, you're still going to be best off with an overdrive pedal going into this. Again, one of the things that's great about it is when you get up to more of a gigging volume, the amp is more warmed up. Really, really likes overdrive pedals when the amp is a little bit warmed up. Not even necessarily talking like edge of breakup tone, just a fatter, warmer tone. So let's talk a little bit about what we're doing tonally and where we're going to go with this and everything. Now, you just heard at the beginning I was playing this guitar, Fender Stratocaster, and a Gibson ES-345 for just great classic Fender clean. The Princeton clean, again, it has that kind of richness, but it also has a punchiness. It's not the big wide clean like you would get from a twin or a super. It's not that really, really bright glassy open one like you would get from a deluxe. It has a little bit of these characters, but it's kind of all focused in this sort of nice small punchy way and everything. And with treble and bass and a volume, it's very, very easy to dial in. Now, the opening tone, what I was doing was going into the number 1 input, and I had the bass at about 7 and the treble at about 5. And I think that that's a setting that works really well for single coils. You can push the bass a little bit more in this amp to fill up your sound, especially to account for it is still bright. It's still the bright kind of Fender sound. Now, on that next clip, using the ES-345, and this amp loves humbuckers. It just works great with Gibson guitars and hollow body guitars. It's really suited well for a lot of guitars, but it loves hollow body guitars. I think, again, because of that sort of like pre-EQ'd almost. It's not pre-EQ'd, but you know what I mean. It's just the way the tone sits, it sort of naturally doesn't emphasize these frequencies that I find troublesome. With that one, I had it plugged into the low gain input, and I had the EQ flatted out. I know that sounds kind of boring, but that's actually my favorite way to run this amp in general is treble at 5, bass at 5, and plugging into the low gain input. I think it just sounds really great. When you plug into the high gain input, it's not over the top like you get some amplifiers where it's too much. I do like pushing the bass a little bit more when you go into the high gain input, the number 1 input. Works really great for gigs that way because you get a little bit more of that aggressive edge, a little bit more clarity, a little bit more punch. And again, you can use that bass and push the bass a little bit more without getting too crazy muddy. So that's what I had going on at the beginning. Now, I'm going to do one more quick tone with the ES-345 here. It really loves that kind of like spunky, country, plucky, bluesy thing. So I'm going to kick on the baritone switch for one really quick, clean clip here, just so you can hear how it sounds going for an older Americana blues country sound. Alright, now let's get into overdrive territory. So I talked about it liking overdrive. Now, there are a lot of different pedals that will work great with this, and please feel free to let us know if you're a Princeton player, what pedals do you pair with it? Generally speaking, my favorite 2 pairings are if I'm going for a blues or country sound, particularly with single coils, I like it with a tube screamer. If I'm going for a rock sound, I'm playing with humbuckers, I like it with some kind of a K-clone type pedal. And the 2 pedals that I'm using today for this video are with the Stratocaster, I'm going to use a Maxon 808 overdrive, and with a Gibson SG that I'm going to be plugging in, I'm using a Wampler Tumnus Deluxe. I think these 2 pedals each work very, very well into it. I think they each kind of get their own unique tone. Now again, like I said, it does take pedals particularly well, partially because it gets to a nice spot where it's warmed up earlier. I really like the way the reverb sits even when you have an overdrive going into it. That's kind of a unique thing. I do want to take one quick disclaimer minute to say this is not a sponsored review. There is some of the gear that I'm using that I have through review deals, including the Wampler Tumnus, as well as the pickups in this guitar and the Gibson SG, which are Lust for Tone pickups. They have not directly sponsored this video, however. Those deals were limited to their own reviews, and everything that I'm using in this review is done so entirely because I like this gear, and I thought that this would all work well with the Princeton. So this is not at all a sponsored review. So now let's dive in with these two guitars using a couple of different pedals to show you some of the different pedal overdrive characters you can get with the Princeton. All right, now before we get to the end, where we're going to turn the amp up a bit more and try a few different things, I do want to take a minute and focus on the reverb and the tremolo, again, because they are something that just make this amp really special. They're very usable, and they can get really rich and present, but in a way that's not terribly over the top. So I'm going to use a Gretsch 6120 now. I'm going to play with the reverb pretty high up, and then also with the tremolo after that, as well as some a generous portion of reverb. You can spread that reverb on some bread and eat it like a sweet reverb sandwich. All right, now we're going to get this amp cooking a little bit more. Now for this, I am going to plug back into the #1 input. For the last several clips, you are hearing it going into the low gain input. I'm going to go back into the number one input so you can really hear it, at kind of full bore and everything. Now, before we get it totally wide open, one of the things that's great about this amp also is you can get a mid-level drive sound from it if you get it just part of the way turned up. So I'm going to have this guitar going into it with it turned up to about 7, and you'll hear it has a nice present drive sound. It's a little bit more than edge of breakup, but it's not a full-on overdrive. It's kind of in that sort of in the middle area, but it's a really great sound. And again, this is something that is great for a studio and just very, very present if you're playing a gig where you're getting up to this volume live. So let's check this out, and then right afterwards I'm going to turn the amp all the way up to 10 and try it with both this guitar and the Gibson SG so that you can hear the amp wide open and what a nice natural overdriven sound it gets with it wide open. Alright, I mentioned this special kind of secret tone. This is the last tone that we're going to do for this video. Sometimes I hear people say, well, what type of amp should I get? Should I get a Princeton? Should I get something smaller? Should I get something like one of the Champ amps, like either a Tweed Champ or a Vibro Champ? Or, what would be the right kind of small amp to get? Well, would you believe me if I told you that this amp can get some kind of faux champ tones, let's say? I think this is the amp to have because it can do a lot. Again, it doesn't sound small, especially if you push a little bit of bass with it and you get it open and you use some of the reverb. It sounds nice and you wouldn't listen to it on a recording and go, oh, they must have been plugging into a small amp. No, it just sounds good. It just sounds like a nice, you wouldn't necessarily say somebody was plugging into a giant stack, but you wouldn't think it was this little boxy thing, this little, kind of like studio rocket type thing. However, that being said, because of its size and because of its ease of use and everything, if you turn the treble and the bass back and you get it wide open, and especially if you turn the reverb off, you can get this kind of like old boxy Fender small amp tone. This makes me think a little bit more of like a Vibro Champ tone, having played Vibro Champs at gigs before. Kind of got a foot in the door into the old Tweed Champ tone. It's not quite that, but it's definitely passable for it if you need it for a studio sound. Now, I've actually got the treble and the bass turned all the way off, got the amp turned all the way up, and the reverb off. Make sure you know what you have, because on some of the Fender amplifiers you actually can't turn the EQ all the way off or you lose your signal. This one you can. This is the one that I have is an unmodded standard production model. So I've got the treble and the bass turned all the way off, got the amp turned all the way up and the reverb off, and it just, doing it that way, it really nails that kind of like small boxy amp in the studio sound, which is a really cool tone. It's very usable, and many classic recordings were done using this. So check out how cool this sounds playing it in a slightly unorthodox way to make it sound like one of those old amps. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Please let us know in the comments, do you have a Princeton Reverb? Are you a Princeton player? Do you have the 65 reissue? Do you have the 68 custom? Do you have a vintage one, a hand-wired one? What do you have? Let us know. Let us know what kind of pedals you use with it, or if the Princeton is something that you're interested in getting. Again, follow the links below where you can listen to some music. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.